Hey everyone, welcome to the Process Mapping Masterclass. I'm your host, Mirvan Farouk. In these webinars, I'll be sharing with you tips and techniques in how to document and implement business processes across your organization. So let's get started. So for those of you who don't know me, a quick intro of who I am, what I've done. I started BPS Partners in 2017. We essentially help our clients implement business process management across our organization, preferably before they go on large scale ERP implementations, business transformations, other strategic initiatives, because implementing BPM, as I'm hoping a lot of you are beginning to realize, and I'll be sharing more and more of it, implementing BPM before such large initiatives saves a lot of time, effort, and money during ERP and business transformations. So that's essentially what we do. So who should attend and who will benefit? I guess anybody who cares about documenting, improving, implementing business processes in your organization, irrespective of your title, whether you're in the C-suite or the shop floor, as long as you care about business processes and implementing them, implementing standard business processes, improving it in your organization, you'll find good value in these classes. Today, I'd like to cover a topic which I feel is mostly overlooked when documenting business processes. It's either overlooked completely, or I find that people don't have a proper structure or a format to follow. So what I've done over the last 20 years, and thanks again to my experience at Enbridge, which is where essentially it started, we came up with a way of documenting process objectives, process KPIs, process risks, more importantly, and process controls and process control gaps. And since, of course, the last 20 years, I kind of evolved that methodology. I call it now Process Risk and Performance Management, PRPM. It's essentially grounded, rooted in COSO ERM principles. I'll talk a little bit about COSO, what is COSO and what is ERM, and walk you through the PRPM framework. I'll share with you how to apply it in real time in the workshops using Excel, using Visio, all that nice stuff. We didn't have any submissions today. We didn't get any process maps from you, so there won't be any live coaching session today. If you need to reach out to me for consulting or guidance, anything of that sort, you have my coordinates on the left. Once I'm done recording the session, today's session, I'll put it up on YouTube. Give me a day or two, so you should find it there. All right. In terms of the schedule, so I think I was a little too overambitious, to be honest with you, when I announced the master classes back in November. Trying to do it bi-weekly. Bi-weekly is a bit too tough given the projects that I have at work and my family obligations as well. So we are gonna move it to monthly sessions now. We'll still keep it to second Thursday every month at 6 p.m. So that's the slight update, and that gives me time again to create some good quality material for you. And I'm always looking for feedback from you in terms of topics that you'd like me to cover. So that's always very helpful. So I'd like to start off today's session by explaining or sharing with you again practical applications as to where you can really apply the process risk and performance management, which is essentially built on the COSO framework. I'm not going to read through all of these, but at a glance, as you can see, whether it's in compliance and regulatory, of course, a lot of what I do has to do with SOX or ISO certifications. I personally never used it on ESG initiatives, but you can absolutely use it on the ES initiatives. Anything that has to do with identifying risks, KPIs, and more importantly, connecting them all to figure out the controls or control gaps, right? To make it a robust process. So IT security, health and safety, supply chain management, quality management, the list is long, so you can take a look at that. Those are the practical applications, and I'm sure there's more areas. Anything that requires you to document a process, look at the risk in the process, understand the process KPIs and the objectives, connect that and understand where the risks are high and how you can mitigate that risk, bring that high or medium level risk down to low or acceptable through controls. That's where you would use what I'm about to talk about, process risk and performance management framework. So as I said, the PRPM framework is grounded in COSO ERM principles. Let me talk a little bit about that. Again, I'm not going to talk through everything on the slide. For those of my friends who are accountants, chartered accountants, or an internal audit should very well be familiar with what is COSO. For those of you who aren't, it's the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations. There are 5 sponsoring organizations that are formed in 1985, like American Institute of Chartered Accountants, Institute of Internal Auditors, and the rest that you can see on screen. COSO's mission is to help organizations improve performance by developing thought leadership that enhances internal controls, risk management, governance, and fraud detection. And the vision is to be, globally recognized as an authority on internal controls and a thought leader on risk management, governance, and fraud deterrence, which is what I believe they have, right? So that's kind of who they are. For ERM or enterprise risk management, they essentially commissioned or published their first report in 2004. And I remember it was, I think, 2005 or 6 when I was at Enbridge. We wanted to document 145 engineering and operations processes, look at the risks in those processes, look at the controls and control gaps, more importantly, and figure out who needs to do what by when. So we looked at that 2004 ERM framework and came up with essentially what I'm about to share with you. And of course, since then, I've evolved it a little bit more. But that was the early days since when I've been using what I'm about to share with you. In 2017, they enhanced their ERM framework. They improved it, their approach to managing risk to meet the demands of an evolving business environment. Again, I've given you a lot of links there. So for those of you who are curious and want to know a little bit more about COSO and the framework, I would encourage you to go and check it out. But what I'm about to share with you is enough, quite frankly, at a high level for what you need to understand, especially if you're looking at it from a process lens and a process perspective is what I'm going to share with you today. So before I get again into the details of the PRPM framework, I want to talk a little bit about COSO, ERM key principles. I'll avoid reading what's on the slide. Again, this video is being recorded, so you can always check it out on YouTube later. Pause the video and read through it. But as you can see in the gray section on the left, it's about tone at the top. It's about setting proper objectives. It's about establishing KPIs. It's about defining risk appetite, identifying and assessing risk, identifying and implement key controls, and strategic alignment of all of the above. So if you go back to the first session that I had, I think it was sometime in early Jan, I talked about the 9 core elements, right? So when I talk about processes, it's not just about process, people, and technology and performance, but you're looking at core values, culture, vision, purpose, strategy. It all comes back to strategic alignment, right? So when you're documenting core business processes, same principles. Anyways, that's what ERM principles are based on as well. And then finally, of course, once you identify for an ERM from an enterprise risk management perspective, COSO requires that once you have that tone at the top and you figure out the KPIs, objectives, risk, controls, all that stuff, you of course communicate it to the organization, right? Across the organization, then you monitor that. So that's pretty much what's on the slide in front of you. So on this slide, I would like to read through these points because that's relevant and on the context of looking at risk and performance management at the process level. So when it comes to process governance, from an ERM perspective, we talk about tone at the top. When it comes to process, you've heard me talk, it's about setting up or identifying first proper process owners. So when you talk about any process, engineering process, operations, logistics, regulatory, finance, IT, I don't care. I'm looking for typically one process owner, not 2, not 3. And that's one of the biggest challenges you'll find in your organization. And the process owner I'm looking for is at a leadership level, senior leadership level. Unlike at times, when you talk about Lean or Six Sigma, they talk more about looking at process owners at the supervisor level, at the work level, and that concept is right. But the kind of work that we mostly do in BPM is at the leadership level. So process owners have to be a senior leader in the organization who has an influence across the organization, because the core process is talking about a spread across the organization, across a functional organization. So if they need to make a change, they need to have enough muscle, enough influence to make that change across the organization. So that's the first piece about identifying the right process owners that can own that process and make those changes. And then essentially what I typically encourage clients is to form what I call a process council. You can call it a process committee. You can call it a process board, whatever it is. And I would typically put all those senior leaders who are the process owners across 30 or 40 business processes, and there shouldn't be too many. There should be like maximum 7 to 8 process owners across an organization. Those would form your process council, right? So the process council's purpose is to make sure the overall BPM methodology, the framework is robust, it makes sense for an organization, it's actively reviewed, it's the tone at the top, it's communicated, right? And as the process, as the new and improved process is implemented, from onboarding, the new rookie who just joined yesterday, down to day-to-day work, people are following a standard process and not how they feel about doing the process their way. I mean, that's essentially the high level of process governance is. So the next step is defining process objectives. We begin by establishing clear objectives. So each business process, these should be aligned with your strategic goals and your operational targets. Now, as I go in the next few slides, I'll practically explain to you that when I'm doing a workshop with, whether it's 2 to 3 people or 10 to 25 people in a big room, what kind of questions do I ask them? Because I'm not going to put up these slides in front of my, subject matter experts. It'll bore them to death, to be honest with you, right? I try to make it more lively. I try and make it more in layman terms, keep the questions a bit vague, but essentially achieve the purpose that I want to achieve. And I'll explain to you in the future slides. But from an educational point of view, connecting COSO ERM framework to process risk and performance management at the process level, you need to understand each bullet point on the slide. So once you have the process governance established, when you start looking at the process, the first thing you do is identify the process objectives. Once you figure out the process objectives, you develop process KPIs, right? That will help you measure the performance of the process against those objectives. These KPIs should be capable of indicating the efficiency, the effectiveness, and compliance of the process. And I'll talk more about that in my future slides. The next thing you do is identify risks. With your objectives and KPIs in place, you identify what risks should prevent you or could prevent you from meeting these objectives. Consider both internal and external factors, of course. Once you identify the risk, the next thing you do is you assess the impact on the metrics. So for each identified risk, consider how it might impact your metrics or your KPIs, your objectives. This will help you prioritize the risk based on the potential to affect critical success factors. So when in the next few slides, I'll talk about inherent risk assessment and residual risk assessment, assessing the likelihood and the impact of those occurrences, and that's what essentially that piece is. Once you've done that, you go and design your controls. So you develop controls that are specifically aimed at mitigating the identified risks. These should be designed to minimize the risk impact on your process objectives and by extension, of course, your process KPIs, right? So now that you have your controls in place, now, once again, when we go in the practical world, with the SMEs in the workshop, as they identify the controls, there are many times, more times than not, that I would find process gaps or other control gaps, right? And that's really what you're trying to figure out. What are your risks? What are your controls that are in place? That's great. But then what are your control gaps? And that's a key finding from these workshops that we have at the process level. So once again, once you've done all that, you implement and monitor, and then you adjust KPIs and controls as needed. So again, I'll let the slide be there. You can read through more details as I move along. So now that you've got a concept in place, let me show you a little bit what I'm saying visually. So you got a process map, right? On the process map, you start identifying your objectives, which essentially is defining the core purpose of what are you trying to achieve from this objective. So when I do these workshops, and I'm being completely candid with you, when I tell people, so what's the core purpose of your process? I mean, I see kind of head shaking and eyes rolling, and as they get used to it, so I typically ask them, tell me your core process objective in 3 crisp bullet points. That's it. And I've purposely say 2 or 3 because I don't want a whole paragraph or 7 to 10 points. Once that's done, once they've defined clearly what their process objective is, the next step is to define the KPIs, right? So essential checkpoints, which are essential checkpoints to ensure your process objectives are being met. Now, I've seen processes that have 25, 30 KPIs, and I think that's crazy. KPI should be few, not too many. KPI should be very focused. And of course, you should follow SMART principles: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, time bound. But try and zero in on essential KPIs, essential checkpoints. Otherwise, one can get very flustered if you've got 20, 25, 15 KPIs in a process. So, and once you've done that, then you go to the risk management exercise of identifying inherent risks in the process. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future slides, how you do that. And as part of that, you see that little grid on the side, high, medium, low. So you kind of go through and identify the risk is high, medium, or low, impact, likelihood, total score, all that nice stuff. And I have a little Excel template that I'll share with you that you can use practically in your workshops. And of course, the last and the most important piece is once you figure out the risk, whether it's high, medium, or low, the whole goal is to mitigate the risk down to an acceptable level. Now, you can never completely eliminate 100% risk. You just can't do that. You've got to bring it down to an acceptable level. Right now, again, that acceptable level may not be low all the time, because to bring it to complete low level, you might have to, I don't know, spend $1 million on some software. I don't know, things that you might have to do that you just can't do. So the business is not always able or capable to spend that kind of money or time or resources. So, like in life, at times you're willing to take certain risks and move on in our journey. Likewise, in a business, you got to accept some risk at hopefully not at a high level, but even if it's at a moderate level, you keep an eye on that risk and you make sure. But that's what this exercise does for you. So whether you're doing enterprise risk management at the enterprise level, or whether you're doing process risk management on the process level, the purpose of the structured approach, figuring out the objectives first, figuring out the KPIs for those objectives, figuring out the risks or inherent risks rather, and then stepping back and looking at the controls, is to figure out that after I put all the controls in place, right, where is my risk? Is it down? Preferably all should be down to a low level, but the ones that are still at a higher or medium, is it acceptable or not? Can I transfer the risk through some kind of an insurance mechanism or something, divestiture or whatever it is? Those are kind of decisions that you got to take at the process or at the enterprise level. Okay, so that's kind of the visual of what you saw on the slide earlier. So how does it all connect? So by first identifying what you want to achieve and how you measure success. So what you want to achieve is the objective, how you measure success, the KPI. You can then identify what might stop you from reaching your goals, which is the risk, and how you can prevent or mitigate those issues, which is essentially the controls. From a visual perspective, again, everything I've said in the last, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes, if it's too detailed for you, the next 4 visuals hopefully connects it all at a very high level. So think of process as a, think of objectives as a world map, right? You're trying to figure out where to go, right? You want to go to Australia, you want to go to China, you want to go Miami, wherever on the map. That's a destination. That's what your process objective is, right? Your KPI is your compass, right? That's directing you to the true north or the true south or the true west. It's your compass. That's what the KPI is. Your risks are your detours or your obstacles on your path, right? That you have to, but that's what your risk is. And your controls essentially are the measures that you put in place to overcome those obstacles. In case of my silly picture, that trampoline that you see there, right? So those are kind of your controls. So that's kind of the visual. Those are the 4 elements. And that's, if you start thinking on those lines, and what I do is in my workshops, as I said, I would put simple pictures like that to make the point, and a lot of people go, aha, now I understand kind of where you want me to go, right? And so yeah, so putting thinking in the sequence ensures that your risk management efforts are always aligned with your performance objectives. So someone recently asked me, so how does it connect to ERM? And the best way I can explain to them again is that, your COSO ERM is a top-down exercise. You're not looking at it, process, definitely not doing process documentation, right? So it's a top-down approach of identifying risks at the enterprise level. You're identifying your risks and performance metrics at the process level is a bottoms up exercise, right? Where you start by identifying your, 60 or 70 processes, and of which 20 or 15 of which are core processes, supporting processes. And you start identifying your subject matter experts, your process owners, you have interviews, you have workshops, focus group sessions, you document current state, you identify the gaps, and then you go through this PRPM exercise and you figure out bottoms up. Now, of course, a lot of what you discover in the process, during the process stage, is quite detailed and not really relevant for a enterprise level risk. But for some of the core processes, there are times when I've found certain risks are missed at the ERM level, right? So that's how you kind of connect the two. When you sit down with your ERM manager, director, VP, whoever, and you go through your key risks that you identified in the process, especially in the core processes, you'd be surprised at times, they might not have been able to figure out that risk or that intensity of the risk or that substance or nature of the risk during their workshops on the ERM side with their knowledge experts. So that's where it all connects, right? So PRPM exercise can identify key risks that were missed during the ERM workshops. That's the point. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to bring it down really very practical for you. So we started by explaining, what is COSO and what does COSO stand for, and the COSO ERM. I put some bullet points there. And then we went through the process risk and performance management framework that I have. I explained to you the theory around that. I'll give you some visuals. I want to give you a little bit more visual, but this time I want to make it very practical for you. So now we have a workshop, whether it's an accounts payable process or an engineering process. Now you got a workshop, you've got 10 people in the room. Where do I start? What do I do? Right. So theory is all good until it becomes real. So the way so what I'm going to do, I'm going to put those 4 pictures again, but this time I'm going to put the exact questions that I ask. And so I like being funny at times, even though I may not be a funny guy, but I find humor kills the tension in the workshop, right? So what I typically do is I tell people, relax, step back, put your feet up, grab that coffee, look at the sky, and tell me, in 2 to 3 bullet points, what are the key objectives or of your process. Tell me your process objectives in 2 to 3 crisp bullet points. What are you trying to aiming to achieve really? And again, initially it's a little difficult at times if people haven't thought it through, but as they kind of really close their eyes and the first person speaks, the second person, it takes time. This is not something that comes out in 5 to 10 minutes. Just those 2 to 3 bullets can take you an hour, at times 2 hours to make it very crisp and clear, right? Especially for somebody who's not used to this kind of structured session. So that's the first point. Once they come up with the 2 to 3, and I say 2 to 3 can be 4 or 5, but I'm not looking for 10. It cannot be 10 to 15 objectives, right? Typically it's high level. So once they come up with those core objectives or the purpose as to why that process is there, what the process is aiming to achieve, the next thing I say is, okay, now step back again, relax, think it through, and of all the KPIs that you have, what are those 2 to 5? And when I'm saying 2 to 5, again, they might come up with 7 or 8. But what are those 2 to 5 KPIs that helps you ensure that your process objectives are being met, right? So that's your compass. That's a compass that's telling you heading in the right direction. That's what the KPIs are. Okay, so now when they're done that, the next step again is, and I try and make it really funny by this point, because we're getting into risks, right? And people tend to get a little fearful. I don't know why when you talk about risks, but this is where I kind of say that, free up your mind. Absolutely no fear. Just think of all possible outcomes. Think of all possible outcomes and what can potentially go wrong. And the other thing I tell them is, because a lot of these people start thinking of their process map and the controls that they have. So in my opinion, it is absolutely critical that you don't have process maps in the room or on the screen or on the wall, because they tend to keep looking at the process map and they try and look for those controls in the process map to figure out and work it backwards on the risk. In fact, what I've learned over time is that when I start these process documentation sessions where the client wants me to document process risks and process controls, I would prefer not to start with process documentation. I would prefer to start with the PRPM approach first because they're absolutely unbiased, right? They know, of course, what the process is, so they can clearly tell me what the process objective is and the process KPIs are. But when it comes to the process risk, we have not documented the process, we have not done the controls. So it's very easy for me to take out those core risks from them, right? So this is where they take out, and I keep reminding them that please don't think the controls you already have in place. I'm looking for inherent risks, possibly what can go wrong, irrespective of your controls in place or not in place, right? I'm looking for inherent controls, and that's what that question is. So once they come up with that, then of course my next question is leading them towards the controls. So that's when I say, what measures do you have in place or should have in place to avoid that risk from materializing in the first place? So then they start thinking, okay, so maybe I can, of course I'll start thinking of controls they already have in place. But as part of the exercise, almost every single time, I've done this over 20 years, they will come up with a step, which is essentially a control that they should have in place that's not in place. And that is the aha moment that you're not normally looking for. Another thing I'll tell you from my experience, I mean, most people that again I work with the client, first of all, they never had a chance, taken out from their day job in a workshop to brainstorm on process, leave alone risks and controls, right? Um, Especially when it gets to risks and controls, they have a really big aha moment, right? They go, whoa, these are all the risks, which by the way, I never came up with. They came. I'm not the smartest guy in the room. I never am. I'm only a facilitator, right? So when they come up with the right risk and they go, whoa, these are all the risks in the process, and these are all the controls I have in place and not have in place, it's a really big kind of a win moment for the team. Just kind of putting it out there for those of you who are process champions in your organization. You should consider following this approach. Okay, so by this, and again, I'm emphasizing this is not a 1 or 2 hour exercise. It never is if you do it right. Again, you don't want to stretch this over 7 or 10 days, but this is typically between a 3 to 6 hour all in, from identifying objectives, KPIs, risks, controls, gaps, and what I'm about to share on the Excel spreadsheet. It's a 3 to 6 hour exercise depending on how simple or complex. If it's more complex, it can take more than 6 hours. So try and split it between 2 to 3 days if you can. So the next thing I wanted to share with you. So between steps 3 and 4, what I do is once the risks have been identified, we go into assessing the inherent risks, right? Identifying, and I'll share more of that with you on the next slide I have, when I have the Excel table. But essentially, we go through assessing the likelihood and the impact of that risk. And once you do that, and once you have the controls in place, once you figure out your inherent risk, you figure out what your controls are. So A minus B, then I would tell me what your gut feel is on that residual risk. Now, I intently use that word gut feel, and I want to talk a little bit about that. And I would use that word gut feel also on the inherent risk, right? So again, there's a lot of details. I don't have time enough to kind of talk about that, but I would typically put a risk appetite, depending on your, which I would create with the leadership team first. That covers like reputational risk, financial, operational, health and safety, high, medium, low. So it has a little appetite. I would put that on the wall and say, this is your organization's risk appetite across, 5, 6 core measures. That's what low, medium, high means. And then I would say that inherent risk we talked about, please tell me what is the likelihood of that risk materializing in the absence of a control. And I'll say use your gut feel. Same thing with the impact, right? And the reason I use the word gut, and I explained the gut, that my gut feel on a process that I'm doing at a client is 0, right? Because I don't know the business as well as the person who's doing that work for the last 20 years, who knows the internal and external factors. So the gut feel of the person doing the actual work is a very intelligent gut feel. But end of the day, it's a gut feel. There's no rocket science on it, right? So I just wanted to make that point. Now, So once they figured out the controls are in place, same thing with the residual risk. The goal is to figure out if the controls are enough in place to bring the high or medium inherent risk down to low on the residual side. And that's the gap. And once you do that, then the next step is figure out, who will implement the control gaps and by when. So everything I've discussed so far is essentially on that final slide. That's the Excel that I have. So you'll see in the first column, there's a process objective. So I would do this in real time. I would put the Excel on the screen and start capturing it. Also, there's a beauty of whether you're documenting a process map or whether you're doing performance risk assessment, right? There's a beauty of doing it in real time in front of your audience, whether you're doing it on Teams or in the room. But don't just do it on the whiteboard, because as you start typing stuff, people start looking at it and they go, no, that's not what I meant. So I'd say, what did you exactly mean? Help me phrase it properly. And in that process, there's that back and forth that happens. Anywho, sort of in the first column, I would capture the process objectives. Once I've done that for process X, whatever that process is, I would go to the second column, tell me the supporting KPI or the KPI that will, help you measure the objective of the process. Once I've done that, then the fun begins. I say, step back, put your feet up, look up in the sky, and tell me what can potentially go wrong. And in that what can potentially go wrong, I emphasize that I'm looking at inherent risk, which is, my column here. So therefore, you cannot think of the controls in place. Just imagine there's no controls absolutely zero controls in place. What can potentially go wrong? So then they go, well, if you say it that way, this can go wrong, that can. So we have a lot of fun, but in that fun process, it calms the nerves and people start speaking up. And in that people speaking up, a lot of stuff comes up. Now, as a facilitator, while I'm also having, good time with the people, I'm paying attention to what's going on. Verbal cues, non-verbal cues, connecting the dots, probing. So in all that back and forth, the real risks start coming up. And again, when I write the risk, I write it in front of them. So I want to make sure everything I write has to be crisp and clear. No vagueness, no I think. I want it very clearly documented. So that's how we capture the risk. When we capture the risk, the next thing I would do is, fill out the likelihood column. And I use a simple high, medium, low matrix. If the likelihood is less than 25%, I'll say let's call it low. If it's 25 to 75%, I'll say let's call it medium. If it's likelihood is more than 75%, I'll say let's call it high. On the impact side, as I mentioned, I would work. And I'm sorry, I just didn't have time to work on this for too much. I mean, I would have probably added one more slide to kind of show you what the risk appetite and stuff is. But I would typically work with the management and say, whether from your scorecard or what matters most to you, financial, operational, health and safety, reputational, those are the typical 5-6 items. Let's make a little grid, high, medium, low. What does worst case mean to you? What does, so on and so forth. And then that's something I'll put on the wall or the screen and say, hey, Bob, based on that risk appetite of your organization, please tell me what is the likelihood and the impact of this thing. If it materializes, what is the impact? Will it be high, medium, or low based on your gut feel? So once that happens, then we do the high times high is high times medium is high, so on and so forth. So you saw that little grid that I had on the previous slide, and that's how it calculates the total inherent risk. The controls. So once they have the inherent risk figured out, I would start focusing on the ones that are high or medium first, of course, and I would say what can you do to prevent the risk from materializing. So I'm looking for controls, and again, I'd avoid putting any process maps in front of them. So during that brainstorming session, a lot of stuff comes out. More times than not, as I said, control gaps come out, stuff that's not documented or they haven't. It's not about documentation, stuff that they're not following. Nobody has thought about. Controls that are not thought about. That's what control gaps are. So with the controls identified, whether the controls are in place or gaps, right? That's your residual risk. So inherent risk minus controls in place or gaps is your residual risk. And at that point, I'll say, now step back and now tell me, again, based on your gut feel, based on your experience gut feel, with all these controls, does that inherent risk come down to a low? And then there'll be discussion, likelihood, impact, all that stuff. And they'll say, yeah, maybe, or maybe not. And there'll be discussions, right? So the whole goal is preferably to bring it down to low. And the way to bring it down to low is to keep thinking, what else can we do? What else? What other controls can we put in place? That's what we try and do. But there are times where you just can't. You got to leave it at medium or at high, and in that case, you take it back to management and say, this is where we are. What do we do? And you accept the risk, you transfer the risk, whatever you do. For the control gaps, the last two columns, I would say, so who's going to work on it now, right? I need a name, I need a target date. And again, for the name, I'm looking for one name, not two, not three names, and a specific target date. So that's pretty much it. In terms of the Visio, you've seen the template before. So in the template, under the steps, you will see on the left, there's a little square with a number. That's the explanation. On the right, there's a little circle. That circle is what I use as a reference for the control step, right? So once I capture it in the Excel, from the Excel, I would copy paste it on the Visio. So on the Visio, the first page is your process map. And again, depending on how big the process is. On the second page is the explanations. On the third page is the controls. So I would just copy paste literally from Excel into Visio, and then whatever Visio references, I would put that in that circle under the step. So when somebody's looking at the process, they don't have to keep going back on Excel. They can see it at one glance, right? They can go on the process. They click the next page. It's explanations. They click the next page. It's controls. So that's the process that I follow. Just to recap, once again, we covered the practical applications today, the framework of COSO, how I apply PRPM in the workshops and on the Visio. We didn't have any process maps today, so there won't be a live coaching session. So with that, I'm going to take any questions. What is the estimated time taken to finalize objectives, KPIs, and control measures of a single process? Even simple processes, right? I think simple processes maybe 2 hours. Depends again on your definition versus my definition of simple. But I would say 2 to 3 hours. At 3 hours at minimum, can take up to 6 hours. I've done process maps that on risk and control assessment that have taken like a week, even week, 10 days. Again, not of course 9 to 5 sessions. I'm talking 2 hours each day, or 2 to 3 hours, or 1 hour each day, like that. You love the session. Thank you very much. Great to learn the process. Thank you very much. Do you say that this before? Yeah, so it's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest with you. Fitz, I've done it. I've done the process mapping first and then the risk and control assessment, depending on how the client wants it. My personal preference in terms of speed of completing the whole project, in terms of having an unbiased session on risk and control assessment, is not to document the process. And again, understand I've been doing this for 20 years, quite frankly, right? So I'm kind of very familiar with how to do it. In terms of the process mapping also, if you kind of start talking to me, I'll quickly pick it up in my head, and right? So depending on the number of years of expert at my stage, when I do the process risk and performance management, I kind of know the process by then. They may not have discussed the process map with me, but I know the entire process in my head, because that's how the workshop goes. But the advantage there is that they don't keep going back on the process map and keep looking at that control, right? I want them to have a completely unbiased session. That's why. So hope this helps. If there's no other questions, I think we'll call it a day. Thank you once again for joining in. If you have any questions, reach out to me on my LinkedIn or my email. I'll put this up on YouTube over the weekend, hopefully, or by Monday. Thanks again. I'll see you next month. Cheers.